So when you talk about the kind of decline of sort of Soviet Empire and the Eastern European countries kind of breaking free from Soviet influence, do you want to go into the history of that a little bit? Because if that was one of the defining influences on your thinking about America today, and what was the process by which these countries changed the way that power was expressed within them?
Yes, we've been very much influenced by the East European experience, which, by virtue of a number of visits to that part of the world, I had the opportunity to observe them at close range. But beginning with the creation of the Solidarity movement in 1981 in Warsaw, there was an initial tendency among American Sovietologists, experts in the Soviet Union, to say this is never going to happen. The Soviets will intervene. They will prevent this from happening. And lo and behold, by 1989, all 6 of the so-called satellites of the former Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, etc., the 5 of the 6 of them rid themselves of their communist regime, and all did so non-violently, with the exception of Romania. And what captured our attention about this was the process, that the process was basically to show that the emperor has no clothes, that these communist regimes had lost their moral authority, they were corrupt to the core. And we think that's what's going on in the United States, that the U.S. government has lost its moral authority. It too is corrupt to the core, and is it's owned, operated, and controlled by Wall Street and corporate America.
So one of the things I think that hangs up a lot of people when they discuss this is there's this sense here that we've had more than 100 years of saying the Pledge of Allegiance, for instance. So one nation under God, indivisible. And we have this, this carefully crafted, in many ways, sense of national identity as Americans. So there's a sense that almost, like this is something that has always been, even though it hasn't, and is in itself the result of the historical process. But in the hindsight is 2020, so we look back now and say, oh, the Soviet Union, its economy was in shambles, centralized planning doesn't work. But at the time, how did people perceive the Soviet Union, and was it seen as, oh, it's about to completely fall apart, or was that something that almost happened out of left field?
No, almost the exact opposite. It was perceived as they were going to be in business for a long time. Sovietologists, the CIA, assured us that they were very strong, they were a major threat. Ronald Reagan referred to them as the evil empire. The implication was they're going to be around for a long time. So the collapse came really pretty fast in 1989.
And all of those people who are saying, it's this powerful force, it'll be with us forever. It had been with us for 70 years. Like, why not another 70? Like, what was their reaction when suddenly they saw this immensely, in terms of geopolitical shift, fast process happen? Like, what was their reaction to it?
I think it was incredible disbelief that it happened as fast as it did. I mean, the 6 East European countries, it all happened in about 6 months in 1989, and then 2 years later, the Soviet Union completely imploded, divided into 15 separate independent republics. It was pretty amazing how fast it happened.
And how did those people who were caught off guard by and surprised, the majority of the country and the world probably were in that category, how did they, or what was the general reaction and perception of your thoughts on the empire, the Soviet Empire, and your writings throughout the 70s and 80s? I mean, did you have an audience that received them well and took you seriously when you were saying that these things are not sustainable, that this is going to break apart, and then it eventually did? What was your audience, and what were some of the reactions that you saw?
Well, by virtue of the fact that the Soviets illegally translated one of my books on computer simulation models into Russian in 1974, I began having a lot of visitors from the Soviet Union and East Europe, and then which led to my own visit to Moscow in 1982. and I had the opportunity to observe what was on the horizon at very close range 3 years before Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. And in this May of 1982 visit, what I saw in about a dozen Soviet economic research think tanks was that all of these economists, management scientists, computer scientists were working on the same problem, evaluating the effects of introducing decentralized planning, flexible prices, money, banking, all of these capitalistic ideas into the Soviet economy. And I asked, why is this happening? They said, we've got very big problems, the same problems that were being duly noted in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. When I began writing about this, there was skepticism, particularly from the Sovietologists, because they all assumed the empire would go on indefinitely.
To break in just for a moment, would you mind sort of explaining who the Sovietologists were at the time? Like what, like not maybe names, but like kind of what positions they occupied, whether it was in government or academia or? Yeah,
it was a mixture of it could be people in the CIA, the U.S. State Department, but it was also at the leading Soviet departments in places like Harvard or Princeton that had leading Sovietologists on the academic side. But unfortunately, they all had a common bias. To be a card-carrying Sovietologist, you had to be strongly anti-Soviet, and I was really never into that.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned they illegally translated one of your books that you had published here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to just explain that for
Well, the interesting thing about that was that it was a book on how to do computer-based planning models in a free enterprise market economy, because that was the only type of economy I knew anything about when I wrote the book in the early 1970s. And the book sold twice as many copies in Russian as it did in the United States. It was a very technical book. And when I went to Moscow in 1982, they paid me royalties in rubles more than I could spend in the 24 hours, which I had to spend them. I had to spend them in 24 hours, so that was it.
You couldn't bring the rubles back here?
No.
There was no sort of currency exchange in the United States at the time?
Those are no-no. You couldn't take the rubles out.
Oh, okay, really?
No.
Not at all?
Right.
Wow. Do you think there'll be a time where you can't take dollars out of the United States?
Who knows? It's getting pretty scary.
Yeah, well, no one will want them outside the United States pretty soon.
Right.
So kind of moving on to your project now, that we've got sort of a background of why one of the reasons why you're advocating secession for Vermont. But if Vermont or other states reach the point where it really was seen by a majority of our population to be that we would be better outside of the United States than as a member of the United States, what would be the process by which we would go about doing that?
Before I answer that, let me fill in one other little detail.
Mm-hmm.
What I was really saying is that what I'd uncovered in my experiences in Moscow and the Soviet Union was I'd come to the conclusion that the United States had become much more nearly alike than its old nemesis than most Americans were prepared to accept, and that fundamentally the problem was about size. That sure, communism was a corrupt and evil system, but what really ultimately brought down the Soviet Union was you couldn't manage 280 million people from one central bureau in Moscow. And it's my conclusion that you can't manage 320 million people from one central bureau in Washington, D.C. But anyhow, now to the process of how might secession work. I mean,